The sound is the first thing you notice. Not the roar of the crowd, that is a sound the mind expects, a sound from history books, a blunt instrument of noise. No, this is different. This is the sound of water finding its way into a locked chest. It is a slow, insidious gurgle, a whisper against wood. It is the sound of surrender patiently waiting. Imagine, if you will, a body of water in late autumn, the kind of pond that sits at the edge of a New England town, where the reeds have turned to the color of old bone and the surface is a mirror of slate-gray sky. There is no sun here, only the diffuse light of a world holding its breath. On the bank, a crowd has gathered, their breaths forming small clouds that dissipate into nothing. They are here to witness a cleansing. They call it a test, but a test implies a chance of passing. They bring her forward. Her name is written in the margins of history, a name that was meant to be erased. She is bound, her wrists tethered to her ankles with coarse rope. They have tied her to a wooden chair, a simple thing of oak and rung, meant for kitchens and hearths, not for the cold embrace of a river. They lift her, and the chair feels light to them, for she has been starved of more than food. She has been starved of hope. He does not scream. This is the detail the official records omit, the detail that haunts the periphery of the court transcripts. They report the charges: detestable witchcraft, compact with the devil, the usual litany of fear dressed in legal language. But they do not record her silence as they drag her to the water's edge. They do not record the way she looked at the sky, not in supplication, but in recognition, as if she had known all along that the sky would be the last thing to witness her defiance. The water is not cold, it is something far worse than cold. It is absolute. It is the temperature of the earth itself, a dense black cold that steals breath before the lungs can even draw it in. They push her. The chair tips. There is a moment of suspension, a terrible, graceful arc, and then the surface breaks. This is where the story should end. The logic of history, the logic of the Salem witch trials, dictates that she should sink. The guilty, they said, float. The innocent, the pure, are embraced by the water, pulled down to a watery grave. It was a logic built on inversion, a cruelty disguised as piety. But the water did not want her. Or perhaps she refused the water. As the bubbles rise to the surface, small, frantic circles that pop against the silence, something happens that the townsfolk did not account for. The chair does not sink. It drifts. It lists to the side, caught in a current no one else could feel. And from beneath the slate-gray surface, there is no struggle. There is only a stillness so profound that it frightens them more than any witch's curse. They pulled her out, of course. They had to, because to let her drown would be to admit the test was a failure. They dragged her back to the shore, gasping and sputtering, not the water but the crowd. They pulled her out so they could try again, but she had already crossed a threshold. She had been to the bottom and returned, and in that moment she became something the law did not have a name for, a survivor. She was the woman who refused to drown. And this is her story, a story not of a witch, but of a woman whose crime was existing on the wrong side of a village's fear. We will follow her from the mud of the riverbank to the cold stone of the jail, from the whispered accusations to the quiet, unshakable truth of her survival. Keep the candle lit, for the shadows grow long, and the waters of history run deeper than we are ever told. It begins, as these things so often do, not with a shriek but with a scent. A slow October afternoon. The kind of afternoon where the light struggles to push through the small, leaded glass windows of a saltbox house, settling instead into a thick, honeyed gloom. Inside, the air is a tapestry of smells, the acrid bite of wood smoke, the sweet rot of apples stored for winter, and beneath it all, the warm, yeasty exhalation of bread. Our protagonist stands at the hearth. Let us call her by the name the records left behind, a name that carries the weight of English soil: Elizabeth. Not Elizabeth as the court would later paint her, a crooked, cackling crone consorting with fiends. No, this Elizabeth is a woman of perhaps 40 winters, her hands dusted with flour, her face lined not with malice but with the hard-earned geography of a life lived close to the bone. She kneads the dough with a practiced rhythm, a rhythm older than the church that towers over the village green. It is the rhythm of the earth itself. Push, fold, turn. Push, fold, turn. She works in silence, but her silence is not empty. It is a vessel filled with thought. She is thinking of the rye she ground this morning, the grain she had to winnow by hand because the miller, Mr. Putnam, has raised his prices, claiming a poor harvest. She is thinking of the neighbor's child, the Paris girl, who has been sick with a fever that comes and goes like a tide. Elizabeth had sent a poultice of boneset and yarrow over the fence 3 days past, wrapped in a square of linen. She had not asked for payment. She never did. Such things were a currency of their own, a network of kindness that kept a village breathing when the winter winds came howling down from the north. But there is a new scent in the air today, one that does not belong to her kitchen. It is the scent of fear. It drifts in through the gaps in the wooden planks, carried on the voices of women returning from the meeting house. They speak in hushed, urgent tones, their words fractured by the wind. Twisted in her bed, unnatural, Reverend Paris says it is a hand not of this world. Elizabeth's hands pause just for a moment on the dough. She knows what they are saying. The village has been a tinderbox for months, ever since the winter that refused to end, ever since the wolves grew bold and the cattle grew thin. Fear is a crop that grows best in lean soil, and Salem village in the year of our Lord 1692 is a field ripe for harvest. She continues kneading, push, fold, turn. To understand what is about to happen to Elizabeth, one must first understand the lines that divided Salem village from Salem town, the invisible boundaries that mattered more than any fence. It was a division born of ambition and pettiness, a quarrel over land and tithes that had festered for a generation. On one side, the Putnam, a family of farmers who wanted independence from the more mercantile, cosmopolitan town. On the other, the Porters, who saw the village as a mere appendage of their seafaring prosperity. And caught in the middle were the women, the wives, the widows, the ones who tended the sick and birthed the children and kept the old knowledge alive. Elizabeth was a Putnam by marriage, a fact that should have offered protection. But protection in a place like Salem was a fragile thing, a cobweb that could be torn by a single word. She had a sharp tongue, they said. She knew things she ought not to know. When Goody Putnam's cow had sickened last spring, it was Elizabeth who had come with a tincture of pennyroyal and whispered words over the beast's heaving flank. The cow had lived, and in the days that followed, Goody Putnam had looked at Elizabeth not with gratitude, but with a shiver of unease. How did she know what the cow needed? How did she know to mix those herbs, to speak those words? The answer, of course, was simple. She had learned it from her mother, who had learned it from hers. A chain of women reaching back across the Atlantic to the hedgerows and cottages of Old England. It was the wisdom of the poor, the practical magic of survival. But in the winter of 1692, simplicity was a luxury the village could no longer afford. The first accusation comes not with a bang, but with a knock. It is evening. Elizabeth is removing the loaves from the oven, their crusts a deep, burnished brown. The knock is sharp, insistent. The knock of a hand that does not expect to be turned away. She opens the door to find Thomas Putnam, her husband's kinsman, standing on her threshold. Behind him, the twilight is the color of a bruise. He does not meet her eyes. He stares at the loaves, at the steam rising from them, and his lips press into a thin, bloodless line. "You are summoned," he says, his voice is flat, "to the meeting house on the morrow." She does not ask why. She already knows. The rumors have been circling like crows around a carcass. The Paris girl, Betty, and her cousin Abigail have begun to writhe and shriek in their beds, claiming to be pricked by pins, tormented by specter. They have named name, and one of the names, whispered in the dark corners of the meeting house, is hers. Thomas turns to leave, then pauses. He looks at the poultice of boneset sitting on her windowsill, drying for future use. His eyes harden. "Best leave off your remedies," he says. "The Reverend says the devil works through such things." He is gone before she can reply. She closes the door and leans her forehead against the cool wood. For a long moment, the only sound is the crackle of the fire and the distant, mournful lowing of a cow. She thinks of the river. She thinks of the water, dark and patient, waiting at the edge of the village. Push, fold, turn. The rhythm is all she has left. The meeting house is a structure designed to make a soul feel small. Its ceiling is low, its windows narrow, its pews arranged in a rigid geometry that leaves no room for deviation. On this morning, the morning of her examination, it is packed with bodies pressed together for warmth and for the spectacle of righteousness. The air is thick with the smell of wool, unwashed flesh, and the cold sweat of anticipation. Elizabeth is brought before the magistrates. They sit at a raised table, their faces half obscured by the shadows cast by the single candle that sputters on the oak. Magistrate John Hathorne, a name that will echo through history as the very embodiment of judicial cruelty, leans forward, his eyes two pinpricks of flint. "Elizabeth," he intones, his voice carrying the weight of the state, the church, and the judgment of a king. Why do you afflict these children? The question is a trap, a piece of rhetorical geometry as precise as the pews themselves. It assumes the guilt it seeks to prove. She does not answer immediately. She looks past him to the front row of the gallery where the afflicted girls sit. They are young, most of them, their faces pale, their eyes wide. One of them, Abigail Williams, the minister's niece, begins to shake, a fine tremor that starts in her hands and spreads to her shoulder. "She pinches me," Abigail cries, her voice high and reedy. "Look, she pinches me now." And indeed, a red mark blooms on the girl's arm, as if pressed there by an invisible thumb. The crowd gasps. Elizabeth feels the room tilt. She knows with a clarity that terrifies her that she is not witnessing a trial. She is witnessing a play. The script is already written. The magistrates are the audience. The afflicted girls are the actors, and she is the villain they have cast her to be. "I know not what you speak of," she says. Her voice in the silence that follows sounds like a stone dropped into a deep well. Hathorne's eyes narrow. "You do not know. You who have been seen at all hours gathering herbs, whispering to the sick. You whose husbands' lands are in dispute with good Christian men. You say you do not know." The geometry tightened. Every question is a lead weight pulling her toward a confession. If she denies the charges, she is obstinate. If she admits them, she is guilty. If she speaks, her words are twisted. If she remains silent, her silence is proof of a compact with the devil. Throughout the morning, the afflicted girls perform their suffering with a skill that borders on artistry. When Elizabeth shifts her weight, they cry out that they are being stabbed. When she clenches her hands, they claim she is choking. They contort their bodies into unnatural shapes, their limbs twisting, their necks craning, their tongues lolling from their mouths. It is a grotesque ballet, a spectacle of pain designed to terrify the room into belief. And the room believes. The crowd murmurs, their fear transmuting into a righteous fury. They see what they have been primed to see, the hand of Satan reaching out from the margins of their community to tear apart their children. But Elizabeth sees something else. In the brief moments when the girls' performance falter, a quick glance to see if the magistrates are watching, a suppressed smile when a particularly dramatic spasm draws a gasp, she sees calculation. She sees girls who have discovered a terrible power, the power to destroy with a word. And in that understanding, a cold, clear thought forms in her mind. They are not bewitched. They are the bewitchers. She refuses to confess. When Hathorne demands she answer for her familiar spirits, she tells him she has no familiar. When he asks if she has signed the devil's book, she says she has no knowledge of such a book. Her answers are simple, direct, rooted in the stubborn facts of her own existence. But simplicity in the geometry of fear is a liability. It is read as defiance. And defiance in a witch is proof of guilt. By the time they lead her away, her hands are bound, her wrists raw from the rope. The last thing she hears, as the heavy door of the meeting house closes behind her, is the voice of Abigail Williams, clear and sharp as a bell. She will not confess. The devil has made her proud. The jail is not the dark, dripping dungeon of romantic imagination. It is worse. It is a common house, a converted dwelling with a dirt floor and a single grate for a window. She is thrown into a cell already occupied by a woman named Sarah Good, a homeless beggar who had been accused weeks before. Sarah is half mad with cold and hunger, her eyes wide and unblinking, her lips moving in a constant, silent prayer. Elizabeth sits on the floor, her back against the stone wall. She watches the light from the grate move across the floor, a slow pilgrimage from one corner to the other. She thinks of her kitchen. She thinks of the dough, left on the board, probably hard and cold by now. She thinks of her children, scattered to relatives who will now look at them with suspicion, as if the stain of her accusation could be passed through blood. A guard brings her a cup of water. She drinks it slowly, feeling it slide down her throat, feeling the last warmth of her kitchen fade from her memory. The water is cold, but it is not the cold that frightens her. It is what the cold represents. It is the precursor. The swimming test is not mentioned yet, not in so many words, but she has heard the whispers in the meeting house. She knows what they do to those who refuse to confess. She sets the cup down. Beside her, Sarah Good begins to weep, a dry, rasping sound like wind through dead leaves. Elizabeth does not weep. She closes her eyes and listens to the sound of her own heartbeat, a steady drum in the darkness. Push, fold, turn. The rhythm is still there. It is all she has, but it is enough. The machinery of the trials will grind on. The accusations will multiply. The jails will fill. But for now, there is only this: a woman, a stone floor, and the slow, inexorable approach of water. They come for her on a morning that does not feel like a morning. The sky is a seamless lid of pewter, pressing down on the village until the distinction between earth and heaven is erased. The air is cold, but not with the sharp cold of winter. It is the damp, bone-deep cold of late autumn, a cold that settles into the marrow and does not leave. She is taken from the jail and led, not to the meeting house, but to the edge of the village. The crowd that follows is smaller than the one at her examination, but it is no less hungry. These are the ones who wanted to see justice done with their own hands, or at least with their own eyes. They are farmers, laborers, a few women with their children hoisted on their hips to witness the spectacle. There is no magistrate present. This is not a trial. It is an extrajudicial ritual, a custom borrowed from Old England, a test that has no basis in colonial law but carries the full weight of local fear. They lead her to a pond, not the great river that flows to the sea, but a smaller, darker body of water, fed by a spring that bubbles up from a deep crevice in the earth. The locals call it the Drowning Pool, a name that speaks to its purpose. It is a place where the town has always brought its unwanted thing: the stillborn child, the rabid dog, the woman accused of consorting with powers beyond the pale. They have prepared a chair, a simple kitchen chair like the one she used to sit in by her own hearth. They have tied ropes to its legs, long ropes that will allow them to lower her into the water and, if necessary, pull her out again. The logic of the test is a perversion of baptism. Water, the element of purity, will accept the innocent and reject the guilty. The innocent will sink, pulled down to a peaceful death. The guilty will float, their sinfulness making them buoyant, and will thus be proven witches to be hanged. It is, of course, a death sentence either way. They bind her to the chair, her wrists to her ankles, her torso to the back. The ropes are rough and they chafe against the bruises already darkening her skin from her time in the jail. She does not fight them. She has learned in the weeks since her arrest that resistance is a currency they want her to spend. They want her to scream, to weep, to confess. She gives them nothing. Two men lift the chair. For a moment she is suspended above the ground, her body a bridge between the world she knew and the world she is about to enter. She looks out at the faces in the crowd. She sees Thomas Putnam, his expression unreadable. She sees the midwife who once called her a friend, now crossing herself as if to ward off evil. And in the back she sees her daughter, a small figure in a gray dress, held back by a neighbor's hand. Their eyes meet. Elizabeth does not shake her head. She does not smile. She simply looks, a long, steady look that says, "Remember, remember that." Then the men carry her to the water's edge. They swing the chair once, twice, and let go. The impact is not what she expected. It is not a shock of cold. It is a shock of pressure, a sudden, total compression that seems to push the very breath from her lung. The water closes over her head, and the world above becomes a distant, muffled roar. She opens her eyes. The murk is dark, thick with stirred-up sediment, and she can see nothing but the vague shapes of the ropes trailing upward like the threads of some great, dark web. She does not struggle. This is the part they do not understand. The instinct to fight, to thrash, to claw her way back to the surface. It is there, a primal scream in her muscles, a fire in her chest as her lungs begin to burn. But she has spent a lifetime learning to quiet her body, to still her mind, to wait. She learned it in the birthing chamber when a woman's life depended on calm. She learned it in the sick room when a fevered patient needed a steady hand. And she learned it in the jail, in the long hours of darkness when the only way to survive was to become as still as the stone beneath her. She lets the water take her. She lets her body go slack, her mind retreating to a small, quiet place deep within. The burning in her lungs becomes a distant ache, then a strange, cold clarity. She sees in her mind's eye the dough on her table. Push, fold, turn. The rhythm continues, even here, even now. Above the surface, the crowd watches. The ropes go taut, then slack. The chair, weighted with a woman, should sink. It should descend to the bottom, a clear sign of innocence, and they would let it stay there. A watery grave for a woman they would then call cleansed. But the chair does not sink. It drifts. It tilts to the side, caught in a current no one else can see, and begins to move slowly across the surface of the pond. A murmur ripples through the crowd. This is not how the test is supposed to proceed. The chair is not floating exactly, but it is not sinking either. It is suspended, caught between the two, a thing that does not fit the neat categories of their logic. The ropes tighten. The men on the bank brace themselves, expecting to pull up a corpse. They pull. The chair rises, dripping from the water, and in the chair Elizabeth is still. Her head is lolled back, her eyes closed. Water pours from her mouth, her nose, her hair. She is the color of ash. For a long moment there is silence. Then she coughs. A single, convulsive spasm that brings a gush of water from her lungs. She draws a breath, a raw, ragged sound that cuts through the quiet like a blade. She is alive. The crowd recoils. A woman screams. A child begins to cry. Because if she is alive, if the water rejected her, then she must be guilty. The logic is inescapable. They have performed the test, and the test has proven what they already believe. She is a witch. But the logic leaves no room for what to do next. They cannot hang her, she has not been tried. They cannot let her go, the water has spoken. They stand, paralyzed, on the edge of the pond, looking at the woman in the chair, who is now looking back at them with eyes that hold the cold, dark clarity of the depths. She does not speak. She does not need to. Her survival is its own accusation, a judgment upon them all. They cut the ropes and drag her back to the jail, not because they have decided her fate, but because they do not know what else to do. She has broken the geometry. She has refused the binary. She is neither innocent nor guilty, neither drowned nor saved. She is something new, a survivor, and survivors, in the logic of fear, are the most dangerous things of all. The Salem jail, in the months that follow, becomes a city of the condemned. It was never designed for such a purpose. It is a small, wooden structure, its walls of hand-hewn timber, its floor of packed earth that turns to mud when the winter rains seep through the roof. It was meant to hold debtors and petty thieves for a night or two, a place for them to sober up and reflect on their sin. Now it holds more than 24 women, some with children, some with chains, all with the stench of fear clinging to them like a second skin. Elizabeth is given a cell in the deepest part of the jail, a room with no window, only a narrow grate in the heavy door that lets in slivers of light and the constant, maddening sound of dripping water. The drip comes from somewhere in the roof, a steady, rhythmic pulse that she cannot escape. It becomes the clock by which she measures the days. Drip for a minute, drip for an hour, drip until the light through the grate fades to darkness, then begins again. She is not alone. In the cell beside her is Rebecca, nurse, a woman of 71 years, a pillar of the community, a grandmother whose piety was once beyond reproach. Rebecca's voice, when she speaks, is thin but steady, a thread of sanity in the darkness. "They say I killed the Putnam children," Rebecca whispers one night, her voice filtering through the cracks in the wall. "They say I appeared to them in the night, a specter with a black hat. I have never worn a black hat in my life. I cannot abide the thing." Elizabeth does not laugh, but a sound escapes her, a dry, rasping thing that might be a laugh or might be a sob. "They say I float," she says. "They say the water proved me guilty, and then they locked me up because they could not decide what to do with a guilty woman who did not drown." There is a long silence. Then Rebecca speaks again, her voice softer, touched with a sorrow that is deeper than, "My daughter says I must confess. She says they will let me go if I only confess, but I cannot confess to something I have not done. My soul is all I have left." Elizabeth presses her hand against the cold, damp wood of the wall. She can almost feel the warmth of the other woman's presence on the other side, a flicker of human connection in a place designed to extinguish it. "Do not confess," Elizabeth says. The words come out harder than she intended, a blade wrapped in velvet. "If you confess, they win. They take your name, your life, your soul. They take everything. And if I do not confess, they will hang me," Rebecca replies. There is no accusation in her voice, only a weary acceptance. Is that not the same? The days blur together. Elizabeth learns to read the sounds of the jail as others read a book. The heavy tread of the jailer's boots means food, a crust of bread, a cup of thin gruel. The jingle of keys means someone is being taken to the meeting house for examination, or, as the weeks pass, to Gallows Hill for execution. She learns the names of the condemned by the sound of their weeping. Sarah Good, the beggar who shared her cell, is taken first. Elizabeth hears her cry out as they lead her away, a cry that is not fear but rage. "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take my life, King will give you blood to drink." The words echo in the stone corridor long after Sarah's footsteps have faded. Elizabeth repeats them to herself, a mantra against the darkness. "King will give you blood to drink." It is a curse, perhaps, or a prophecy, but to Elizabeth it sounds like a promise that the world in the end will demand a reckoning. Rebecca Nurse is taken in July. Elizabeth hears the rustle of her skirts, the soft murmur of her prayer. She presses her hand to the wall one last time, but there is no answering pressure. Rebecca is gone, walking to the gallows with the dignity of a saint, her head held high, her eyes fixed on a horizon that Elizabeth cannot see. When the jailer comes to Elizabeth's cell, she braces herself, but he does not unlock the door. He slides a piece of paper through the grate, a petition with a list of names. "The court wants a confession," he says, his voice flat. "Sign this and you walk free." She picks up the paper. In the dim light she can make out the words, "I, Elizabeth, being a poor sinner, do confess to having entered into a compact with the devil." The language is formal, the handwriting neat. It is a lie, a beautiful, well-crafted lie designed to give the court what it needs. A conviction without the messy business of a trial. She holds the paper for a long time. She thinks of her children scattered and alone. She thinks of her kitchen, the scent of rye bread rising from the hearth. She thinks of the river, the cold embrace of the water, the moment she refused to die. She tears the paper in two. Then she tears it again and again, until it is nothing but a handful of confetti that she lets fall through the grate onto the jailer's boots. "Tell them," she says, "that the water already asked, and I said no." In the absence of confession, she crafts another kind of truth. When the magistrates come to interrogate her again, she gives them what they want, but not in the way they expect. She tells them stories. She tells them of midnight meetings in the fields, of a tall man in black who promised her riches and power. She describes the familiar spirits they accuse her of keeping: a yellow bird, a black dog, a serpent with eyes like burning coals. She weaves these tales with a straight face, her voice calm, her eyes steady, her hands folded in her lap as if she were recounting the events of a particularly vivid dream. The magistrates scribble furiously, their quills scratching across the pages of the court record. They are thrilled. A confession. At last, the woman who survived the water is breaking. But Elizabeth is not breaking. She is spinning like a spider in a web of her own making, giving them threads to follow that lead nowhere. She knows with a certainty that has become her only comfort that her stories are too elaborate, too detailed, too fantastical to be true. No one confessing to witchcraft under duress speaks of serpents with eyes like burning coals. They speak of pressure, of pain, of the simple, desperate desire to make the questioning stop. But the magistrates, drunk on their own power, cannot see the absurdity. They take her words as gospel, transcribing them into the official record as proof of her guilt. And in doing so, they do something Elizabeth never anticipated. They give her a kind of immortality. Her name, her confession, will be preserved in the archives of the court, a document that will be read by historians for centuries to come. They will not see her irony. They will not hear the laughter buried beneath the words. But she will be remembered, not as a witch, but as a woman who, when given a choice between silence and a lie, chose to tell a story so outrageous that it could only be a lie, and dared them to. In the darkness of her cell, she smiled. It is a small, fleeting thing, but it is there. She has found a way to survive, not just the water, but the words. And words, she knows, are the only things that last. In the long months of her imprisonment, Elizabeth builds a world. It is a world of the mind, a landscape of shadows and echoes, but it is as real to her as the damp stone of her cell. She calls it her cartography of nightmares, a private map of the spectral realm the court insists she inhabits. She begins with the village. In her mind, she walks the streets of Salem, but they are not the streets she knew. Here, the houses are empty shells, their doors hanging open, their windows dark. The meeting house is a great black shape, its steeple a finger pointing at a sky that has no star. The pond where they tried to drown her is a sheet of black glass, still and perfect, reflecting nothing. She populates this world with the creatures the magistrates have accused her of keeping. The yellow bird sits on her shoulder, its feathers the color of old parchment. The black dog follows at her heels, its paws making no sound on the cobblestone. The serpent coils around her wrist, a cold, smooth weight that she has come to find almost comforting. They are her familiars now, not because the devil gave them to her, but because she has created them, given them life from the raw material of her imagination. In this inner world, she is not a prisoner. She is a cartographer, a surveyor of the unseen. She walks the spectral streets, nodding the places where the fear is thickest, the Paris parsonage, where the afflicted girls first began their fits, the Putnam farm, where the land disputes festered like open wound, the jail where she sits, its walls made of shadows instead of wood. She is not alone in this world. The other accused women are here too, their specters walking beside her. Sarah Good, her eyes bright with a wild, unquenchable fire. Rebecca Nurse, her steps slow but steady, her face turned toward a light only she can see. They do not speak, these spectral companions, but their presence is a comfort. They are the ones who did not survive, the ones who were hanged or died in prison, and in her cartography, she gives them the freedom they were denied in life. The cartography serves a purpose beyond mere escape. It is a form of resistance, a way of reclaiming the narrative the court has stolen from her. When the magistrates ask her about her spectral visits, she describes this world to them, giving them the details they crave. But she gives them her version, not theirs. She tells them of walking through the village with her familiar, of visiting the houses of her accusers, of watching them sleep. She describes the spectral realm as a place of silence and shadow, a reflection of the world above, but a reflection that shows the truth hidden beneath the surface. The magistrates listen, their eyes gleaming with the hunger for more. They do not understand that she is not confessing to a crime. She is describing an act of creation. She is building a world, and in doing so, she is building herself. There is a historical truth buried in this chapter of her story. During the Salem witch trials, many of the accused who confessed did so in elaborate, often contradictory detail. They spoke of witches, Sabbath, of flying through the air on poles, of signing the devil's book in blood. Historians have long debated the meaning of these confessions. Some see them as evidence of genuine delusion, a collective hysteria that infected even the accused. Others see them as desperate attempts to survive, to give the court what it wanted in the hope of lenience. But Elizabeth's cartography suggests a third possibility, that for some, the act of confessing became an act of defiance. By embracing the role they were forced to play, by performing the part of the witch with such gusto, they subverted the power of their accusers. They turned the trial into a theater of the absurd, a place where the line between truth and fiction became so blurred that neither the magistrates nor the afflicted girls could tell where reality ended and the performance began. In her cartography, Elizabeth keeps a list. It is not written on paper, she has none, and even if she did, the jailer would take it. It is written in her memory, a list of names that she recites to herself each night, a litany of the lost. She begins with the executed. Bridget Bishop, who was the first to hang, her body left to rot on Gallows Hill for all to see. Sarah Good, who cursed her judges with her dying breath. Rebecca Nurse, whose piety could not save her. And so many others, their names fading into the obscurity of the official record. Sarah Wilds, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe. She says their names aloud, whispering them into the darkness, and in the whispering she gives them back a piece of what was stolen from them, their identity. She also keeps the names of the survivors. These are the ones who confessed and were released, their names cleared but their lives ruined. They are the ones who walked away from the gallows, their souls intact but their reputations in tatters. She includes her own name on this list, not as a boast but as a promise. She will survive. She will carry their names with her, a cartography of memory that will outlast the court, the jail, the village itself. The months pass. Winter gives way to spring, and the light through the grate in her door shifts, growing longer, warmer. She hears whispers of change. The governor, William Phips, has returned from England. He has heard of the chaos in Salem, the dozens of people languishing in jails, the gallows that have claimed too many lives. He has dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer, the special court that oversaw the witch trial. A new court is being formed, one that will not accept spectral evidence. Elizabeth listens to these whispers with a stillness that hides a storm of hope. She has survived the water. She has survived the jail. She has survived the cartography of her own nightmare. And now, perhaps, she will survive the madness itself. She presses her hand to the wall, where Rebecca Nurse once pressed hers. The wood is cold, but she imagines she can feel a warmth beneath it, a pulse of life that refuses to be extinguished. "I am still here," she whispers. "I am still here." And in the darkness of her cell, the names of the lost echo back to a chorus of the forgotten, reminding her that survival is not enough. To truly survive, she must remember. And to remember, she must one day walk out of this place and tell their story. The change comes not with a bang, but with the slow, grinding sound of a key in a lock. It is a different key, turned by a different hand. The new jailer, a man named Nathaniel, has a face that is not unkind, though his eyes are weary. He has been tasked with moving the prisoners who are not yet condemned to a less crowded facility in Ipswich, a town on the coast where the air smells of salt instead of. Elizabeth is given a place in the cart that carries her away from Salem. She does not look back. She has learned, in her months of imprisonment, that looking back is a luxury to free. For the prisoner, the only direction is forward. The cart rumbles over the rough roads, and for the first time in nearly a year, she feels the sun on her face. It is a pale sun, a winter sun, but it is warmth, and it seeps into her bones like a balm. She closes her eyes and lets it wash over her, feeling the shadows that have taken up residence in her chest begin to loosen their grip. In Ipswich, the jail is different. It is not a converted house but a proper structure built of stone with a roof that does not leak. There are windows, small, barred, but windows nonetheless, and through them she can see the sky. She can see clouds moving across it, birds flying, the occasional sail of a ship making its way to the harbor. She can hear the cry of gulls, a sound she has not heard since she was a girl, walking the wharves of Salem town with her father. She is not the only prisoner. The Ipswich jail holds a mix of the accused and the common criminals, debtors, thieves, a man accused of slandering his neighbor's wife. The accused witches are kept separate, but the walls are thin, and she can hear the conversations of the other prisoner, the mundane squabbles and jokes that remind her that life goes on, even in the shadow of the gallows. The dissolution of the court of Oyer and Terminer is not the end of the trials, but it is the beginning of the end. Governor Phipps, alarmed by the growing number of accusations and the influence of the accusers, has ordered that spectral evidence, the testimony of the afflicted girls about what they saw in their visions, can no longer be used to convict. It is a seismic shift, a recognition that the very foundation of the trials is built on sand. But for Elizabeth, the change is not immediately liberating. She is still a prisoner, still accused, still waiting for a new court to determine her fate. The months in Ipswich stretch into a year, then two. She watches the seasons change through her window, the snow melting, the trees budding, the summer heat making the stone walls of her cell feel like an oven, the autumn leaves falling to cover the ground in a carpet of gold and red. She learns through whispers that the political winds have shifted. The powerful families who supported the trials, the Putnams, the Hathorne, are now in retreat. The new governor, a man named William Stoughton, is less enthusiastic about the prosecution. And most important, the public is beginning to question the morality of what was done. The confession of one of the afflicted girls, a young woman named Ann Putnam Jr., who publicly apologized for her role in the accusations, has shaken the community to its core. Elizabeth does not feel triumph at this news. She feels a cold, hard satisfaction, a recognition that the machinery of fear, once set in motion, cannot be stopped by a single apology. It can only be outlasted. In 1693, Elizabeth is finally brought before the new court. The proceedings are nothing like her first examination. The meeting house is half empty, the magistrates are distracted, and the afflicted girls are nowhere to be seen. The charges are read, the evidence is presented, and the court, with a weary efficiency, finds her not guilty. She is released. No apology is offered, no restitution given. Her property, seized when she was accused, has been sold to pay for her imprisonment. Her husband, weakened by the shame of her accusation, died in her absence. Her children, scattered to the winds, are strangers to her now. She walks out of the Ipswich jail a free woman, but a woman with nothing. No home, no family, no place in the world she once knew. She stands in the street, the salt air filling her lungs, and she does not know where to go. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and she watches it for a long time, watching the light fade from the world. She does not return to Salem. She cannot. The village that tried to drown her is no longer her home. It is a place of ghosts, of memories that would consume her if she let them. Instead, she walks east, toward the coast, toward the sea. She walks for 3 days, sleeping in barns and hedgerows, eating what she can forage from the roadside. She walks until the land gives way to sand and rock, until the sound of the waves drowns out the voices in her head. She stops at a small fishing village, a place that has no name on any map she knows. She is taken in by a family of fishermen, people who ask no question, who see only a woman in need of shelter. And there, on the edge of the world, she begins to build a new life. It is not a grand life. It is a life of small things, the mending of nets, the salting of fish, the tending of a small garden behind the cottage they give her. She does not speak of Salem. She does not speak of the water. She lets the sea wind scrub the past from her bone, and slowly, day by day, she learns to breathe again. But she does not forget. In the quiet hours of the night, when the moon is full and the tide is high, she sits on the shore and watches the wave. She recites the names of the lost, her voice barely a whisper, carried away by the wind. She knows that she is not just surviving for herself. She is surviving for the ones who did not make it out of the water, for the ones who were hanged on Gallows Hill, for the ones who died in the jails with their names still stained. She is the keeper of the story, and as long as she lives, the story lives with her. The fishing village has no name, or rather, it has a name that shifts with the tides, a name the fishermen use among themselves but never write down. It is a place of transience, of people who have come from elsewhere and will, in time, move on. It suits Elizabeth. In this nameless place, she can be nameless too. She is just the widow, the woman who keeps to herself, the one who knows which herbs will cure a fever and which will ease a cough. She spends her days in solitude, but it is a solitude she has chosen, not one that has been forced upon her. She tends her garden, the plants she has gathered from the edges of the woods. Rosemary for memory, chamomile for calm, feverfew for the aches that settle into her joints as the years pass. She has not abandoned her old knowledge, but she has learned to keep it private, a treasure she shares only with those who ask with genuine need. One day, a woman comes to her door. She is young, perhaps 20, with the sun-weathered skin of those who work the sea. Her name is Mercy, and she is with child, her first. She is afraid, as all first-time mothers are afraid, and she has heard that the widow knows things, that the widow can help. Elizabeth looks at her for a long moment. She sees in the girl's eyes the same fear she saw in the eyes of the women of Salem, the same fear that was twisted into accusation and murder. But this fear is different. It is a natural fear, a fear of the unknown, not a fear of the other. She opens her door wider. "Come in," she says. "Sit by the fire, I will make you a tea." She brews a pot of raspberry leaf and nettle, herbs that will strengthen the womb and calm the nerve. She speaks to Mercy in a low, steady voice, telling her what to expect, what to do when the time comes. She does not speak of her own children, the ones she lost. She does not speak of Salem. She speaks only of the body, of its wisdom, of the ancient rhythm of birth that has not changed since the first woman brought forth the first child. The years pass. Elizabeth grows old in the fishing village, her hair turning from brown to silver, her hands growing gnarled with the work of survival. She delivers Mercy's child, a healthy girl, and then the next, and the next. She becomes the village's unofficial healer, the one they turn to when the fevers come, when the winter cough settles into the lungs, when the fishermen are pulled from the sea half-drowned and need to be brought back to life. She does not refuse them. She has spent too long in the shadows of accusation to withhold her knowledge from those who need. But she is careful. She never charges for her services, never accepts payment beyond a loaf of bread or a basket of fish. She does not want to be beholden to anyone, does not want to create the kind of obligation that can turn, in times of fear, into a weapon. She lives in a small cottage at the edge of the village, close enough to be part of the community, far enough to maintain her solitude. She keeps a garden, as she always has, and she keeps a small flock of chickens that provide her with eggs and, occasionally, a meal. She is not rich, but she is not poor. She is simply there, a presence, a witness. In the evenings, she writes. She has taught herself to read and write in the years since her release, using a Bible given to her by one of the fishermen's wives. Now she uses a scrap of paper, a piece of charcoal, to record the things she remembered. She writes the names of the lost, the ones she recited in the darkness of her cell. She writes the stories they told her, the confessions they made, the last words they spoke before they were led to the gallows. She writes in a language that is not English, but a kind of code, a script she invented herself, so that no one who finds these papers will understand them. She is building a paper menagerie, a collection of stories that will outlast her. She does not know if anyone will ever read, does not know if they will survive the damp and the mice and the ravages of time. But the act of writing is a form of prayer, a way of keeping the dead alive in the only place they can still exist, memory. One day, Mercy's daughter comes to her. The girl is 12 now, bright-eyed and curious, with the same restlessness that Elizabeth remembers in herself, before the trials, before the water. She sits at Elizabeth's feet, watching her grind herbs with a mortar and pestle, and asks the question Elizabeth has been waiting for, dreading for a decade. "Grandmother," the girl says, for she has come to call Elizabeth grandmother, though they share no blood. "Why do you never speak of where you came from?" Elizabeth's hands pause on the pestle. She looks at the girl, at her earnest face, her open eyes, and she sees a reflection of her own daughters, the ones she left behind in Salem. They would be grown now, perhaps with children of their own, perhaps having survived the stain of her accusation, or perhaps having been consumed by it. She does not know. She has not dared to find out. "I came from a place of fear," Elizabeth says finally, her voice soft. "A place where people forgot that their neighbors were human and saw only demons." The girl's eyes widen. Were you a witch?" Elizabeth sets the pestle down. She reaches out and takes the girl's hands in hers, feeling the warmth of young skin, the pulse of life beneath it. "I was a woman," she says. "That was enough." She tells the girl a story. Not the full story, not the horrors of the jail, not the cold embrace of the water. She tells her a story of a village that lost its way, of a fear that grew like a weed in a neglected garden, of the women who were plucked from their homes and accused of crimes they did not commit. She tells her of the swimming test, the logic of it, the cruelty of it. She tells her of the ones who drowned and the ones who did not. The girl listened, her face pale, her hands gripping Elizabeth's as if she might be pulled away at any moment. When the story is over, she is silent for a long time. Then she looks up and her eyes are wet. "Why did they do it?" she asks. "Why did they hurt those women?" Elizabeth sighs. It is the question she has asked herself 1,000 times, in the darkness of her cell, in the solitude of her cottage, in the quiet hours when the moon is full and the tide is high. "Because they were afraid," she says. "And fear is a poison that makes people do terrible things. But you must remember this. The fear is not the truth. The fear is a lie they tell themselves to make the world smaller, easier to control. The truth is that we are all connected, all part of the same web of life. When you hurt one, you hurt all." She releases the girl's hands and returns to her grinding. The pestle moves in a steady rhythm, push, turn, push, turn. The girl watches her for a moment, then gets up and leaves, her steps soft on the packed earth floor. Elizabeth does not know if the girl understood. She does not know if the story will be passed on or if it will die with her, but she has told it. That is enough. That is all she can do. The years turn into decades. The Salem witch trials fade from living memory, becoming a story told around hearths on winter nights. A cautionary tale about the dangers, fear, and fanaticism. But the story that is told is not the whole story. It is a story shaped by the survivor, or rather, by the survivors who were deemed worthy of memory. Elizabeth is not among them. Her name appears in the court records, buried in the vast archive of accusations and confessions. She is listed as Elizabeth, wife of accused of witchcraft, found not guilty, discharged. No more. No details of her survival, no mention of the swimming test, no acknowledgement of the months she spent in jail, the names she whispered in the darkness, the stories she wrote in her invented script. She is a footnote, a statistic, a name without a face. This is the silence of the historian. It is not a malicious silence, not a deliberate erasure. It is the silence of convenience, of narratives that must be simplified to be told. The story of the Salem witch trials has a shape that historians find satisfying. The accusations, the trials, the hangings, the remorse, the apology. It is a story of madness and redemption, a story that allows the community to move forward without fully confronting the horror of what was done. But Elizabeth's story does not fit this shape. She was not hanged, so she does not belong to the martyrs. She did not confess, so she does not belong to the penitent. She simply survived, and survival in the grand narratives of history is often seen as less dramatic than death, less heroic than martyrdom. It is a quiet, stubborn thing, a thing that does not make for good story. In the year 1870, a man comes to the fishing village. He is a historian from Boston, a thin, earnest man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a notebook filled with questions. He has heard rumors, passed down through generations, that a survivor of the Salem trials lived out her days in this place, that her descendants might still be here, that there might be papers, documents, some trace of her existence. He finds Mercy's granddaughter, now an old woman herself, living in the same cottage Elizabeth once occupied. She invites him in, offers him tea, listens to his questions with a face that reveals nothing. "I am looking for a woman," he says, consulting his notes. "Her name was Elizabeth. She was accused in 1692, found not guilty, and then the record goes silent. I believe she may have come here to this village. I was hoping you might have some information, perhaps letters or a diary, or—" The old woman shakes her head. "She left nothing," she says. "No letters, no diary. She did not want to be remembered." The historian's face falls. He had hoped for a discovery, something that would make his name, something that would fill in the gaps in the historical record. But the old woman is not lying. Elizabeth did leave nothing. Nothing but the paper menagerie, the stories she wrote in her invented script, and those stories have long since crumbled to dust, their secrets lost. But the old woman has something else. She has the stories her grandmother told her, the stories passed down from mother to daughter, from grandmother to granddaughter, a chain of memory stretching back to the woman who refused to drown. She does not share these stories with the historian. She has learned from Elizabeth that some stories are not for strangers, not for the archives, not for the dry pages of history books. Some stories are for the living, for the ones who carry them in their blood. She tells the historian nothing. She lets him leave disappointed, his notebook empty, his questions unanswered. She watches him walk down the path to the road, his figure growing smaller and smaller until it is swallowed by the tree. Then she goes inside and closes the door. She sits by the fire, as Elizabeth used to sit, and she speaks the names aloud as Elizabeth taught her. She speaks them not to the historian, not to the world, but to the flames, to the darkness, to the silence that has always been the true home of the forgotten. The historian's visit is a turning point, though the old woman does not know it. He goes back to Boston and writes a book about the Salem witch trials, a book that will become the standard account for generations. In it, he mentions Elizabeth in a footnote. A woman of this name was accused, but her fate is unknown. She likely died in prison or soon after her release. It is a small thing, a footnote, but it is a form of erasure, a final, gentle push into the oblivion of the forgotten. The old woman, when she hears of the book, does not rage. She understands, perhaps better than the historian himself, that history is not the same as memory. History is written by the victors, by the ones who survive to tell the tale. Memory is different. Memory is the quiet thing that lives in the corners, the stories that are told in whisper, the names that are spoken in the dark. She is the last keeper of Elizabeth's memory. She knows that when she dies, the stories will die with her. There will be no one left to speak the names, no one left to tell of the woman who survived the water, the woman who built a new life on the edge of the world, the woman who kept the stories of the lost alive in her heart until her dying day. But perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the stories do not need to be written down, preserved in archives, studied by historians. Perhaps it is enough that they were told, that they were held, that they were passed from hand to hand, from heart to heart, for as long as there was someone to hold them. The old woman thinks of Elizabeth, sitting on the shore in the moonlight, watching the waves, whispering the name. She thinks of the paper menagerie, crumbling to dust in the corner of the cottage, its secrets lost to time. She thinks of the historian, writing his footnote, erasing the woman he could not find. She smiles, a small, sad smile. "They will never find you," she whispers to the memory of Elizabeth. "You are safe now. You are safe in the silence." And somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, Elizabeth's spirit hears her and is at peace. Today, the town of Salem is a place of tourism and remembrance. Visitors come from all over the world to walk the streets where the trials took place, to visit the museums, to stand on the spot where those were hanged. In the heart of the town, there is a memorial, a series of stone thresholds, each inscribed with the name of a victim, each set into a low wall that surrounds a quiet, contemplative space. The names are carved in stone: Bridget Bishop, Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Good, and all the others. 20 people were executed during the trials, 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death. Their names are here honored, remembered. But there are no thresholds for the survivor. There is no stone for the ones who were accused and released, their names cleared but their lives destroyed. There is no stone for the woman who refused to drown, whose survival was seen not as a miracle but as a condemnation, whose name is lost to the margins of history. Visitors walk the memorial, their heads bowed, their voices hushed. They read the names, they touch the cold stone, they pay their respects to the dead, but they do not see the survivor. They do not see the ones who walked away from Gallows Hill, who lived with the memory of the trials for the rest of their lives, who carried the weight of the accusations in their bones until they were laid to rest in unmarked grave. If you dig beneath the surface of Salem, you will find the bones of the story. Not the literal bone. The bodies of the executed were thrown into a crevice on Gallows Hill, their graves unmarked, their remains scattered by the century. No, the bones are the records, the property deeds, the court transcripts, the letters and diaries that survive in archives and attics. They are the fragments of a past that refuses to be fully buried. In the Essex County Archives, there is a box of papers from the Salem trials. It contains the depositions of the accusers, the testimony of the afflicted girls, the confessions of the accused. Among these papers, in a folder marked acquittals, there is a single sheet of paper. It is the record of Elizabeth's release, signed by the magistrate, dated 1693. It is a dry, legal document devoid of emotion, a bureaucratic acknowledgement that the machinery of the court has finished its work. But if you look closely at the paper, if you hold it up to the light, you can see something else. There is a faint impression on the page, the ghost of words that were written and then erased. Perhaps it is a confession that was never signed, a plea that was never heard, or perhaps it is something else entirely, a fragment of Elizabeth's own story, a whisper that has survived against all odds, a trace of the woman who used to be erased. The archaeologists of history spend their lives digging for such traces. They sift through the soil of the past, looking for the fragments that have been overlooked, the voices that have been silent. They know that the official narrative is never the whole story, that the truth lies in the margins, in the spaces between the lines, in the names that were never carved in stone. Let us for a moment imagine a stone. It is not part of the Salem memorial, not inscribed with any name, not set into any wall. It is a simple stone, gray and rough, placed at the edge of a field on the coast where the land meets the sea. There is no marker, no plaque, no indication that this is a grave. It is just a stone, worn smooth by wind and rain, half buried in the grass. This is Elizabeth's grave. Or rather, this is where the old woman, Mercy's granddaughter, placed a stone in memory of Elizabeth years after her death. It is not a formal grave. Elizabeth was buried in the village cemetery, her name lost to time, but it is a place of remembrance, a place where the story can be told, a place where the names can be spoken. If you stand on this stone on a clear day, you can see the sea. You can hear the cry of the gulls, the sound of the waves breaking on the shore. You can feel the wind on your face, the same wind that Elizabeth felt when she walked away from Salem, the same wind that carried her stories across the year. There is no historical marker here, no sign explaining the significance of the place. There is only the stone and the silence and the memory of a woman who used to drown. It is a quiet monument, a monument to the forgotten, a monument to the ones whose names were never carved in stone. Perhaps that is the truest form of remembrance. Not the grand memorial, not the official history, but the small, quiet act of remembering. The stone placed by a hand that knew the story, the name whispered in the wind. The story passed from one generation to the next, not in books or documents, but in the living breath of memory. Elizabeth did not want to be remembered. She wanted to be forgotten, to slip into the silence of the historians, to become a footnote, a name without a face. But memory has its own logic, its own persistence. It clings to the edges of the official narrative. It grows in the cracks of the historical record. It finds a way to survive, even when all the stones are unmarked. She is remembered, not in the way but in the way she hoped. In the quiet places, in the stories told by firelight, in the hearts of those who know that survival is the oldest form of rebellion. We return at last to the water. It is a different season now, perhaps spring, perhaps the golden light of late afternoon. The pond where they tried to drown Elizabeth is still there, at the edge of what was once Salem village. It has changed, as all things change. The village is gone, replaced by a suburban town, the fields divided into lots, the old meeting house replaced by a church with a steeple that points to a sky that is no longer slate gray. But the pond remains. It is smaller than it was, perhaps, its edges overgrown with weeds and cattail, its surface covered with a thin film of green algae. The water is dark, as it always was, a mirror that reflects the sky and the trees and the clouds that drift slowly overhead. Stand on the bank, listen. The sound is not the roar of the crowd, not the accusations, not the screams of the afflicted girls. It is the sound of water, patient, and indifferent, the same sound it has made for centuries, the sound of a world that does not care about the stories we tell ourselves, about the fears that drive us, about the women we drown and the women we save. The current still moves. Beneath the stillness of the surface, beneath the green scum and the fallen leaves, there is a current, a slow, persistent movement that has never stopped. It is the same current that caught Elizabeth's chair, that kept her from sinking, that gave her the chance to survive. It is the current of the earth itself, the deep, unseen flow that connects all things, that carries the past into the present, that refuses to be dammed or diverted. Elizabeth is gone. Her bones are dust, her story scattered, her name a footnote in a history book that no one reads. But her legacy is not in the things she left behind, in the papers that crumbled or the cottage that fell to ruin. Her legacy is in the act of survival itself, in the refusal to be defined by the fear of others, in the quiet, stubborn persistence of a woman who would not be drowned. What does it mean to survive? It is not merely to live, to draw breath, to continue existing in the world. It is to carry the weight of the past without being crushed by it, to remember without being consumed by memory, to move forward even when the ground beneath your feet is uncertain. Elizabeth survived the water, but she also survived the years that followed, the years of solitude, of silence, of building a life from the ruins of the one she lost. She survived the forgetting, the erasure, the slow fade into the margins of history. She survived because she understood something that her accusers did not, that fear is a prison, but memory is a key. Her legacy is in the stories she told, the names she whispered, the paper menagerie she left behind. It is in the old woman who kept her memory alive, who spoke her name in the darkness, who passed the story to a granddaughter who passed it to a daughter, and so on down the years, a chain of memory that has no end. It is in you, standing on the bank of the pond, reading these words, hearing her story for the first time. She is alive, in a way, in the telling. The story is the current that carries her forward, that refuses to let her be forgotten, that pulls her from the water and sets her on her feet again, looking toward a horizon she had to create for herself. The woman who refused to drown did not defeat the system that tried to kill her. She outlasted it. She watched it crumble, watched the accusers confess their sins, watched the town that condemned her turn away from the gallows and back to the ordinary business of living. She did not triumph, but she endured. And in that endurance, she found a kind of victory, a quiet, unshakable peace that no court could take from her. What does her story teach us? It teaches us that the narratives we are given are not the only narratives, that the names carved in stone are not the only names worth remembering. It teaches us that survival is not about heroism or martyrdom, but about the small, daily acts of persistence, the mending of nets, the grinding of herbs, the telling of stories, the whispering of names. It teaches us to look for the ones who are forgotten, the ones whose names are written in the margin, the ones who survived the water and walked away. It teaches us to question the fear that drives us to accuse, to condemn, to drown the ones we do not understand. It teaches us that the current that moves beneath the surface of the world is a current of connection, of memory, of life that persists even when all the stones are unmarked. Stand by the water, listen to the silence. The woman who refused to drown is not a ghost, not a legend, not a cautionary tale. She is a question we carry with us, a question that asks, who have we forgotten? Who have we drowned in the waters of our own fear? And what would it mean today to pull them from the water, to speak their names, to let them live? The sun is setting. The light on the water is the color of candlelight, of dusk, of faded velvet. The current moves unseen beneath the stillness. And in the quiet of the evening, if you listen closely, you can hear her voice, carried on the wind, whispering the names of the lost, a litany that has no end. Bridget, Sarah, Rebecca, Susanna, Elizabeth, Martha, Mary, Alice, Anne, Margaret, Wilmot, Sarah, Dorcas, Mary, Abigail, Mary, Sarah, and all the others, the ones whose names we do not know, the ones who survived, the ones who did not, the ones who refused to drown, the ones who were pulled under, the ones who walk beside us still, in the silence, in the story, in the current that moves beneath the surface of the world. Keep the candle lit. The shadows are long, but the water is patient. And somewhere on the edge of the world, a woman who refused to drown is still walking, her back to the town, her face turned toward a horizon she had to create for herself. Walk with her, listen to her. Remember her. For in the act of remembering, we pull her from the water, we give her the breath she was denied, we let her live. And in living, she shows us the way. Not to triumph, not to conquer, but to endure, to persist, to survive. That is the oldest form of rebellion. That is the story that refuses to be drowned.